Hey everyone, welcome to yet another episode of the Inner Realm podcast. And in this one, I'll be reading a piece of my writing. So, like every other overly and sometimes unwarrantedly opinionated person on the internet, I too started a newsletter. It's called The Unhappy Man. And despite the dramatic, histrionic title of the newsletter, The Unhappy Man, it's essentially the same as what I talk about in this podcast. I try to cover philosophy with a heavy emphasis on phenomenology, existentialism, and of course, religion, because those are the topics that I'm interested in. I didn't want to separate it from what I create here on the podcast because I don't even know if that's possible because it's me who's creating, it's my perspectives, it's me who's engaging with these topics and with these subjects. And one thing I did though was I wrote a couple of axioms for the newsletter. And as I was laying down my points and sort of delineating what the details of these axioms are, I realized, wow, I'm pretty much setting up a framework for all of my creative work. And it only makes sense to read them out here in the podcast because as I do release the axioms, I think there are six axioms, I'll be following them for the podcast too. So, since this podcast is still in its nascent forms, just starting off, I just thought it was a good idea to set some ground rules, so to speak, even though not ground rules in a tyrannical sense, rather more of a framework to prevent myself from getting lost in abstractions and nebulous ideas, so to speak. Now, I'm not going to read the whole introduction to the newsletter. This was the first piece that I sent out. Rather, I'd focus purely on the first axiom that I shared. And I did already share a couple other axioms. I'll be reading them out in the upcoming episodes. But of course, I can't deny or I can't help myself to not read one of my favorite poems by Rainer Maria Rilke because this poem is kind of like it kind of heralds me in what I do. It's my guiding light, and I love it so much. I've read it for to so many people, and so what better way to start off this episode than other than reading this great poem by Rainer Maria Rilke, uh, and it goes like this: God speaks to each of us as He makes us, then walks with us silently out of the night. These are the words we dimly hear. You, sent out beyond your recall, go to the limits of your longing, embody me, flare up like a flame, and make big shadows I can move in. Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. Don't let yourself lose me. Nearby is the country they call life. You will know it by its seriousness. Give me your hand. And I've said it's with such intent I orient myself in starting this newsletter. And I might add, it's with the same intent that I orient myself in this podcast. Having said that, without spending too much time on a unnecessarily prolonged introduction, let me get to the guiding axioms. The audacity to write about the human experience seems like a ludicrous endeavor due to its uncanny ubiquity from poetry to quantum mechanics. I might as well say I'm writing a newsletter about everything and anything that could ever be written about, which becomes meaningless due to its nebulousness. Hence, to contain my propensity to wander off into senseless obscurity and out of respect for the reader, or in this case, for the listener, I'll outline in no particular order of importance and share these guiding axioms for the unhappy man or the Inner Realm podcast in the next few weeks. I do want to add, before I start off on the first axiom, I think as you did notice from that first para, I'm setting these up more for myself than for anyone else, if I'm being honest, because I do know I have the problem of wandering off into obscurity and not sticking to the point, and that can be very, very frustrating when trying to consume, as sometimes coherence and eloquence matters a lot. So that's why I thought it's important for me to share these axioms in the podcast, but also in some way reiterate the framework I want to work through when I'm creating content or when I'm writing. Starting off with the first one, axiom number one, which is the only one that I'll be reading out today. Restrain the urge to overcome unhappiness with ideological prescription. Like love, ideology is blind, even if people caught up in it are not. Slavoj Žižek. We face the pressure of meaning. Camus was right when he said, man stands face to face with the irrational. He feels within him his longing for happiness and for reason. The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. Our predicament lies not in the meaninglessness of the universe, but that from all the sentient beings, we are the only ones that yearn for meaning in this desolate place. If God created man not to desire meaning, then the meaninglessness of life wouldn't be a tribulation. In that sense, God is more malevolent than we can ever imagine, because he not only allows unreasonable suffering, but even plays that loathsome trick on humanity by creating meaning, desiring beings, and a meaningless world. Therefore, our penchant for becoming ideologues, for finding psychic stability through the prescription and imposition of dogmas onto the world is unsurprising. The profound unhappiness this angst brings to our souls makes our capitulation to totalitarian ideologies, for example, Marxism, capitalism, religious fundamentalism, etc., understandable. Such facts of the human heart have to be acknowledged and dealt with ad infinitum. But on that lugubrious note, I ought to specify that ideology doesn't intend to seek truth, nor does it increase human freedom. Ideology exists for its own sake, for its perpetuation. It's a Sartrean nothingness. So I will ardently interdict my natural desire to make this newsletter or this podcast a forum for ideological evangelism. Pause. I apologize. I hope I didn't ruin the flow of the essay, but I did realize that I didn't mention something quite important. If you do want to subscribe to the newsletter, the link's down below in the description. As you probably have noticed, I did skip a whole lot of paras in the introduction, only because I want to focus purely on the axioms in this podcast. As if you want to read the whole newsletter, just go and subscribe to it. But yeah, I just want to mention that point. All right, back to it. I really hope I didn't kill the flow. To write or live, for that matter, authentically and non-ideologically is the strangest of all things. In many ways, it's been the quintessential struggle to be an individual since time immemorial. And apart from authenticity being an existential predicament, modern society seems to hinder us from even raising questions about authentic living. For instance, contemporary culture reeks of the call for constant liberation, self-expression, and bringing one's true self to the world. Yet, as some Frankfurt School sociologists, namely Adorno, Horkheimer, and Habermas, propose, industrial, bureaucratized society allows us only to be free within the confines of the ruling ideology. And freedom itself is a tool used to coax an individual to submit to the establishment. They argued in the 1940s, popular culture does this best through the cultural goods of mass media, film, music, and commercialized sports that make people docile, passive consumers. For them, a true miracle would be if one of the NFL Super Bowl commercials said, You don't need another pair of shoes to be happy. Through this critical lens, even the ostensible social justice messaging, like the direct championing for liberation and equality, is a facade for ideological control. Case in point, telling a woman to be a boss babe or a CEO is simply the prevailing capitalist ideology telling her what to become. The establishment tells her to partake in a company that's yet another overpriced fashion brand, telling young girls to find their self esteem and worth as an individual through owning some product, leading to further exacerbation of the anxiety and insecurity we see in teenagers, especially girls, prevalent these days. Most of this happens subconsciously, unbeknownst to us, but vis a vis women's empowerment. A donor would ask how this would be true freedom. How does this allow an individual to be authentic? In Marxist parlance, he manages to bridge commodity fetishization with reification, where such a woman has forfeited her inner freedom by committing to objects, i.e., fashion products, outside herself. She's made the object a subject while relinquishing her subjectivity. This is the case only if the subject object dichotomy is true. Nevertheless, the existential point of losing one's innerness still stands. Such control is worse than overt despotism of an authoritarian regime, as in our case, we don't even know we're being controlled and how our psyche is changing as a result of it. Having said that, I doubt even being aware of this datum allows one to be truly authentic if such a thing exists. For instance, Adorno was scathingly critical of contemporary Western culture and its concomitant cultural goods, especially the burgeoning Americanism with its jazz music. No, that wasn't a typo. He, in fact, hated jazz. Simply put, footnote, I've greatly simplified and reduced his arguments here for brevity's sake. You can read his original paper on jazz for the particularities, or Conacoustics, Adorno's philosophy of music, which a neophyte like myself would find more palatable. Simply put, he thought jazz wasn't true art, but rather a banal commodity that chained people's spirits to the capitalist machine. It was merely aesthetically pleasing, in contrast to so called serious art produced by high culture like Mozart, which penetrated and changed one's soul fundamentally. In typical leftist thinking, for Adorno, true art makes us question our bland comforts, conformism, ignorance, and subservience to the prevailing dogmas. Art cannot be simply enjoyed for its own sake. Art ought to transform a man, bar none. As he states in aesthetic theory, art respects the masses by confronting them as that which they could be, rather than conforming to them in their degraded state. But who's to say that he too isn't in this degraded state along with the rest of us? Perhaps Adorno is evading his true inner self by indulging in higher culture and intellectual life where his authentic self never comes to light. Anna Freud expounds on this phenomenon in a psychoanalytical theory of defense mechanisms. She highlights how our unconscious uses a variety of defenses, sublimation, rationalization, intellectualization, etc., to name a few, as an outlet for protecting our ego to avoid distressing, anxiety producing thoughts and internal conflicts about our own life. So, being an aesthete, immersing oneself in serious intellectual work, learning new languages, and traveling the world to experience cultures all seem like objects our subjective defense mechanisms exploit. No different from engaging in mindless consumerism or superficial capitalistic accumulation of wealth solely for the sake of accumulation. Footnote. While it seems like I'm making a relativistic argument about one's life choices, I'm not. One could undoubtedly make a qualitative distinction between different modes of life, though perhaps not intellectually. For instance, I'd say it's qualitatively better to learn a new language and broaden one's worldview than to buy yet another luxury watch that has a price tag that's equivalent to the cost of feeding a whole village. It's better to read philosophy and literature over watching Married at First Sight. It's better to travel and experience different cultures than doing vodka shots to the point of passing out on weekends. Or as Vida D. Scudder wrote, creation is a better means of self expression than possession. It is through creating, not possessing, that life is revealed. Having said that, while distinct individual decisions could be qualitatively compared and judged, the essence of two individuals can never be, as to be an individual is infinitely deeper and multifaceted than one's temporal choices. The fragments cannot replace the whole. Kierkegaard elucidates the essence of this datum best in either rule, wherein attempting to outline a theory of human existence, he intimates how we all inescapably live a transient aesthetic life, the life of celebrating constant change and titillation, the life of desire and sensuousness, the life of immediacy and aesthetic reflection. This is in contradistinction to the ethical life Kierkegaard's Judge Wilhelm delineates in his letters to the aesthete. For the person who lives aesthetically sees only possibilities everywhere. For him, it is these that form the content of the future, whereas the person who lives ethically sees tasks everywhere. And yet, in his moral phenomenology, one could argue for a subtler reading to find that even the ethical, societal, and civic duty collapses to the aesthetic as it becomes motivated by self fulfillment. To do good because goodness makes one happy is nevertheless one's ethical passions in effect. And ultimately, the highest stage of life for Kierkegaard is the religious sphere, beyond the binary of the aesthetic and the ethical. When one arrives here, an inner metaphysical phenomenon occurs. In his temporality, one makes an absolute unconditional commitment to the ground of all being that transcends logical reasoning, the prevalent ethics and social norms of the day. We see this radical transposition epitomized in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, where, towards the end of the novel, the protagonist, Raskolnikov, simply accepts he's wrong without any explanation. And perhaps we see this in figures like Martin Luther King Jr. too. They've come in touch with a self transcending, deeper reality beyond coherent truth itself that's scandalous to human reason. Having gone on that tangential point in the spirit of authenticity, I have to admit that I've never experienced this latter religious stage. Kierkegaard writes of with such zeal, nor am I sure if I want to after having read Fear and Trembling. My life has been a constant oscillation between the aesthetic and the ethical. Even reading and writing about the religious life is an intellectual thrill for me rather than a sincere expedition for truth. Kant wrote, and I'm paraphrasing, "If truth shall kill them, let them die." But then I wonder if any of us really seek truth. If truth made us miserable to the point of suicide, would we want it? The problem, as Nietzsche wrote, is that no one has yet been truthful enough about what truthfulness is. The fundamental epistemic confusion will always make ideology attractive to us, and perhaps we can never abandon it. Perchance true authenticity lies in thinking less of being authentic, of trying to be in a particular stage of life, whether it be aesthetic, ethical, or religious, rather simply discovering reality without expectations or suppositions, if such a thing is possible. Much like happiness, the more one thinks of being authentic, the less of one's true self one becomes. Ergo, I will write non teleologically, non prescriptively, but also not merely descriptively, as writing, or recording a podcast in this case, always has a point of view, a perspective. In that regard, I can only try to allow what I read and write to seize me than I trying to seize it. Thanks for listening. I hope you found me sharing this axiom useful and perhaps you got an intimation of what's to come in this podcast.